And although the timing for some of us would be off, because if we figured it into the budget, how do we then pass a budget and repeal the 8% which is in the budget? It'd be inconsistent. But it was brought to the floor anyhow because many people in the community have a different view of what the 8% means and whether or not it was a wise policy decision by the legislature. Now, it came to the floor despite the fact that it would have thrown off the budget, and it failed, and it's back in the Committee of Finance, and I'm sure that after the budget is passed, the Committee on Finance would take a look at that bill. But mainly, I want to explain to the public that the leadership of the legislature, with now the transparency regarding preemption and the policy of bringing things to the forefront, regardless of whether you agree with it or not, is quite important. I think it's an improvement on democracy, it's an improvement on fairness and transparency. And people vote their conscience, what they believe in, what they think is right for the time, what they think is right for the future. And you have a good sense of what's happening by looking at the sessions, because the debate, because of that, now has risen to a different level. And I must commend my colleagues because I think the debate in this session was really good. Of course, sometimes people get emotional, and that's fine because that's the nature of making tough decisions that affect everybody. But the 8% failed, and it failed because some senators believed that it was a premature vote, especially when we were considering a budget and we needed to pass a budget to keep the government afloat, but more importantly to prioritize some of the expenditures that we deem important. One of the measures that I thought we may have to revisit is the hospital, because we reduced the hospitals. And I'm not sure that in these kind of times we want to reduce the hospital budget. We have to revisit that. We revisited in this session a measure that provided for a pension for the former First Lady, and it was revisited because when it was initially passed, most of the senators did not at that time understand how it would be implemented and what would be the amount of money allotted to the pension. When it was brought to the attention of the senators through the legal counsel office and through my office, because we did the research, we found out that maybe that was not the true intent. The intent may have been to allow for a pension, but to allow for a pension based on the salary of the governor when he was sitting at that time, not based on the salary of any raises and any increases in the governor's salary. So, changes were made. And the Senate is demonstrating leadership by self-correcting, providing leadership when there's an understanding that the intent was one way, but the implementation might be a little different. You make a correction. In addition to that, Carol and Roy, I thought that the measure regarding the broadband was important. Once we found out that the broadband legislation that we passed and the structure of the entity handling that broadband was having difficulty, we passed a measure during this session, and the chair of the committee brought the amendment to limit the spending of the fundings that we had approved to help put the broadband in a sense of financial stability with the federal government, because we had to pass a measure to have matching funds. So we limited that fund. And I intend to bring a measure again and bring it to my colleagues where instead of having VINGN and the entire structure that's set up with the PFA, I want to push that over to WAPA. And I want a portion of anything that that broadband brings into the territory to go to relieve the LEAC. And I had a measure in the Rules Committee when the broadband legislation was coming up to do exactly that. It was removed from the legislation when it came to the floor. But I think now that the federal government has pointed out structural deficiencies in VINGN and the PFA, I think it's quite appropriate to bring back that amendment that would have given WAPA the authority to manage and structurally set up the broadband to benefit the people. And I think my colleagues will take a second look at that. We have a session coming up October 27th to deal with federal funds again and to deal with measures that were left over from this last session that we weren't able to put on the agenda. And I think that is a measure that will come up again. So the type of measures that have been promoted in the institution, I think, are well-deserved, and they're well-meaning for the entire community because it addresses the immediate concerns. So when you look at the budget, listeners, it's important to understand the dynamic. We have in difficult times. We're in a crisis in terms of deficit. We're trying to come out of it, and we needed to understand the type of reductions in the various agencies that could help deal with the deficit. Okay, the other thing I wanted to discuss before I leave is the importance, and I think, of this hotel bill that was passed and why there was difficulty with certain senators. First, I want to say that I am a very strong believer that taxes imposed by government should remain in government to provide services that people need. Basic services. Basic services are healthcare, education, public safety, and an infrastructure to deal with waste, to have good roads, to deal with the modern day life that requires government to have community centers, to have sporting complexes, to have beaches fixed up with lifeguards and benches, to have parks, to have a system set up to make life pleasant and better for everybody. Government is responsible for that. And the only way government is able to pay to provide those services to the people who live here is through taxes. And when you start to move away from your tax base and you start to give your tax base to private companies that are in business to make money for themselves, you lose the money and the tax base that you need to provide the services that I just mentioned, beginning with health, education, and public safety. You lose the money to pay the people to provide those services. You lose the money to spend on upgrading some of the buildings in Frederickstead and Christiansted because you're giving that money to a private company so that people could get jobs. Jobs don't provide the local government with just the amount of money it needs. Income tax doesn't do it. There must be taxes. There must be either sales tax, or gross receipt tax, excise taxes, hotel room tax. These things generate money for government to operate. So when a bill comes up, because a private investor has difficulty getting money privately the way how businesses operate to get money, and we have a measure that would give the tax that should be going back to the government to that private company to pay their debt because they can't get a loan elsewhere, I have difficulty with that. I don't think that is good policy. I think that is the policy that was made when there was a contract signed with Hovenza to say, I don't get 2 cents a barrel. That didn't have any vision. Or you get $14 million for the property that you're using, And what happens 40 years later when the property value has tripled and you still paying $14 million? What happens later when you started at 3 cents a barrel, $3 a barrel, and you gain 2 cents from that, and a barrel goes up to $130, and if you had a percentage and if you had a vision, out of $130, you'll be getting a lot more. You won't have problem. So when we make these measures, like the Hovenza deal, and some of these deals that we have made in the EDC companies where they get blanket tax breaks for many years without any graduated release from the tax exemption, then you have problems. And this bill creates a bad policy. It sets up for 30 years or more for this hotel that could be built, for the taxes that would be imposed on that hotel through the hotel tax to go to that private company to pay their debt instead of coming back to the government to help the government or to help with some of the services we need as government. And I think that the principle that I stand for is a lot more financially sound, and it's not short-sighted like how the bill was drafted. On top of that, there's no protection for the government in the bill. The bill has a sum now of $500,000 that these hotels would pay. 20 years from now, they're still paying $500,000, and the value may have gone up 10 times. The same problem that was done with Hovenza, 2 cents a barrel. Why repeat the mistakes when we could learn from the mistakes? So I saw the bill as a bad policy bill, and a principled senator who wants to do better for the territory don't repeat the same mistakes that were made 40 years ago. So I could not vote for that. My conscience won't allow me to go and make that same mistake when I know better. So I hope the people are understanding my position, and the bill passed, and I knew the bill was going to pass because I'm the president. I assigned the bill, we move it forward, and I know how to vote. But I could not, in good conscience, repeat the mistakes that we made before. And to close out, Carol and Roy, I want to say that I truly enjoy serving the people. The audit is the audit. It is of the 26th, 27th, and 28th legislature. We are here to correct some of the mistakes, and we have started to correct some of the mistakes made by the legislatures before. We met with the auditors. We have a response. Naturally, some of the measures mentioned in the audit have to be immediately corrected, and we did that. Our travel policy has changed. Travel policy changed immediately. The procurement policy has changed. So we have made immediate changes when we met with the auditors. And some of the changes now would be published as policy statements. When we get those policy statements, you can go on our webpage and look at them. You can look and see how travel in the legislature operates. You will be able to see how procurement, we put it on our page. We have the policies 90% finished, and we will implement them. That is why we brought in a new executive director. We have a new executive director. We have a new legal counsel. We have made changes. And I want people to feel confident that the 29th legislature will correct many of the mistakes made by the 28th and some of their previous legislatures. And it is correct that an audit helps you to improve. You use an audit to improve on the deficiencies that the auditors found when they were going through your books. There were some discrepancies there, and I met with the former executive director, and he showed me some contracts that maybe the auditors didn't see. And